Welcome to another episode of Brand Forge HQ and Tactics Tuesday. Today we're talking about something that I think is really important for any brand as it continues to grow, which is, when you bring in an agency or, some sort of other vendor and how you work, especially with an agency that's managing ads. We'll talk mostly about specifically on Amazon, but I think a lot of the discussion here is going to apply is if you have an agency that's helping you on Meta or Facebook or TikTok. A lot of these same principles are going to apply of how do you work well with an agency. And so with that, Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike, since I know that, this is something that you've been working and really thinking on a lot over the last few weeks.
Yeah, it's an issue that is going to cost us a lot of money, and some of that is due to the agency, and some of that, quite frankly, is due to us mismanaging that agency relationship. And so I think that's really where I want to place my emphasis. There's really no sense in placing the emphasis on the agency themselves, because I'm not going to divulge the name anyways. I'm not going to throw them under the bus. And also, some agencies don't work out well for one brand, but work great for another brand. Sometimes it just depends on the type of brand that you are, the customer avatar you're shooting at. So, that's probably the unimportant piece. The important piece, I think, for me, is that our agency relationship did go really sideways. We're going to lose a lot of money over it. And at the end of the day, I think most of it comes down to that when we brought on the agency, so just to put this in perspective, we brought on an Amazon account management agency, so a full service agency to manage really the entire Amazon account. The idea being that we felt that we had really, we'll say, pulled a lot of the levers that we really thought that we could pull on Amazon. And so we wanted to start focusing on the levers that we could start pulling off of Amazon, which not only would help us diversify, but also that our expectation, and that still proves to be the case, is that our external efforts would translate to better performance on Amazon from external traffic and branded search and things like that, which we've talked about before. I still think those things are true, and we're still working on that. But because we were having to put so much emphasis and so much focus on our Amazon account, because we're a fairly small team, it just was proving difficult to do everything that we knew we really should be doing externally. So we brought on an agency to manage the Amazon account. That was, in a lot of ways, it was really, okay, refresh some things, take a look in the back end. It hasn't gotten the attention that it needs. It could use a refresh. But mostly, we want you to manage what we have. Like, if you can improve on it, great. But ultimately, our main thing was just manage it. Just maintain what we have. We'll do this thing over here. It'll trickle over, everything will be good. And the problem with that was that our perspective was, once we feel comfortable that they know what they're doing and they understand our brand, we can put all of our emphasis over here and ignore that side. And that was a massive mistake, because we weren't tracking some really important KPIs that we should have been monitoring all along to make sure that they were doing the work that we really wanted them to do. And as a result, we ended up in a really rough spot with inventory this year that's going to cost a lot of money. I mean, it just turned out to be at the absolute wrong time, because it was just prior to the tariff change. And so then we couldn't bring the inventory over from China. And so it just kind of snowballed into something much bigger.
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts there, and just, for listeners that may not be aware, I run an agency specifically for, brands within the Amazon channel. So I think this is a wonderful topic to have from both those sides, from a brand and then also from an agency perspective. And so what I would say that kind of clicks in my brain just based on what you described, and whether, again, a good agency, and this is something that we started to incorporate more and more and getting better at, which is in that onboarding phase of really talking with the brand to say, hey, what does winning look like? So for some brands, that is, hey, we want to hit this sales threshold, or we want to double, revenue, or we want to double profits, whatever it happens to be. In your case, that would have been, hey, we just hey, if you can improve things, that's fantastic. But really winning looks like steady state of making sure that there's plenty of inventory for the products that we have in FBA, that things are getting fulfilled, that the listings are getting, it sounds like are getting looked at on a regular basis, that ads are getting, optimized on a regular basis. And that kind of blocking and tackling of Amazon is being taken care of and maintained, so that way you can focus on other channels. So I think that's something really important that, again, something that we've started to put a lot more emphasis in with the clients that we're bringing on board, of what does winning look like? And obviously as an agency, one of the things that we do is not only try to get the answer to that question, but then look at, how can we get them that win, or even, the first kind of big step towards that win as quickly as possible. So that way the brand is getting value out of the relationship. So anybody listening out there, if you're a brand and you're looking for, a new Amazon agency, if they don't ask you that question or something similar to that, I think that would be a first, maybe red flag with that agency. But then also as the brand, I would say, have that as a responsibility on you, as well as if this is an agency that you're really excited about working with for whatever reason, but they don't ask that question, make sure that that is really clear up front of what winning looks like, and that is put into, concrete number form. So that way the agency knows, like, hey, this is what's being expected of us.
You're muted, Matt.
If we take a little bit of a step back, I think now I have kind of a unique experience in that I work with John at the agency, and I also work with Mike from the brand side. And from my standpoint, I think, if a lot of the clients that we work with at First North are brand spanking new on Amazon, meaning they don't understand even the KPIs to pay attention to. For them, they're just understanding what ACOS is and what TACOS is and that kind of stuff. So for me, I think what's important for brands, especially newer brands that are just launching, are really understanding your business and understanding your numbers. I know that they say that on Shark Tank a lot, but like understanding what the metrics are that are important to your business, and being able to have a conversation with your agency at the very beginning of that is super important. And I think from a ProTough standpoint, I think that they're not only knowing the KPIs that are important, but also paying attention to them. That's really the biggest thing, that the lesson that I learned in this scenario that we're kind of in a roundabout way talking about, is one of the things that Mike said is that we tend to, I as brand manager tended to give a little bit too much trust, in that I wasn't paying attention to the things that they were supposed to be managing. And I think that every brand needs to be paying attention, regardless of if you're with an agency or not. There's certain things, and especially inventory. I mean, inventory is a very, very important thing, obviously, especially when you're heading into your busy season. And it was something that I as brand manager trusted a little bit too much, in that they were going to manage that correctly. So I think that, first of all, understanding from a brand standpoint, like I think it's a bad idea to just outsource to an agency right at the very beginning of your Amazon journey, because I think that you have to understand the inner workings of your business before you hand off the reins and then not pay attention to what's going on. But on top of understanding your business and there's understanding the KPIs that matter, I think that there's still some level of involvement that the brand has to have in making sure that the KPIs are going in the right direction, over and above a weekly meeting. Because I mean, you can meet with them weekly, but if you're not actually paying attention, one of the challenges that we had in the beginning was the reporting wasn't great from the agency that we were. And so that kind of hid a lot of the KPIs that should have been important. And, some of them were easy to suss out. Like, we pay attention to ad spend and ACOS and TACOS and things like that, but things that that fly under the radar and that kind of sit underneath the surface, like inventory. I mean, especially when you're dealing with a brand that, is doing multiple millions of dollars a year, like there's a lot of shipments that come over from China. And if you miss even a week or a week and a half of shipments, which is actually what happened in our case, it sets off this domino effect of things that then, especially when you add in tariffs to the situation and all these other external factors. So I think, bottom line, first of all, I think you need to understand your business more than just handing it off to an agency in the beginning, but also there's a lot of KPIs that you have to be paying attention to as that relationship progresses, just so that you are more in the know than just a weekly meeting or a monthly meeting with your agency head.
Yeah, I think too is, when you dial in on the KPI issue, there's the easy ones, ACOS and TACOS or ROAS, however you want to pay attention to it. But at the end of the day, even those aren't really telling you the full picture of what you really need to be looking at, in terms of maybe your contribution margin at, say, CM2 or CM, and understanding what those numbers look like. And quite frankly, especially if it's a agency that's managing more than just ads, or more than just, this here, like if they're more of a full service agency, well, then they have a little bit more of a responsibility to be hitting those, we'll say, more eagle eye view type KPIs rather than the more detailed ones, such as, ACOS or something. I also think one of the things that we kind of messed up in this, we'll focus specifically on PPC, since a lot of Amazon brands will farm out PPC to an agency, and that is, you can hide a lot, especially if your PPC agency is not properly separating out branded terms from unbranded terms. So when they're creating, campaigns within your PPC account, you should be looking at the structure of those accounts. You should be taking a peek every week or two, or, something, and just kind of getting inside of the campaigns and seeing what keywords are they putting in there? What is the strategy? Make sure that you're talking to the company and don't just say, hey, manage my PPC, but find out from them, what is the strategy behind how they set up campaigns and how they set up ad groups and how they decide on bidding and things like that? Because first of all, if they can't really talk strategy with you in a way that you can understand, then they probably don't understand what they're doing as well as they ought to. But what we noticed, and this was way after the fact, unfortunately, was we got inside of our campaigns and found branded and unbranded terms were all lumped together in the same campaigns everywhere. Well, what happens with that? If you start looking at a campaign, even at a campaign level, if you don't go underneath that, if you're just looking at each campaign and you're looking at the numbers, you could look at a lot of these campaigns and see, hey, my ROAS looks pretty good or whatever. And then if you look, on the overall account, you can also see ROAS numbers that might look relatively decent. But the problem is, if you dig deeper, you'll find that you're wasting a lot of money on a lot of terms, and it's being hidden because the ROAS for a branded keyword is so much higher. And so it was throwing off all of our numbers. We couldn't separate out what was branded search and how is it performing, versus non-branded and new to brand and that sort of thing. And so it was really kind of just an absolute mess on the PPC side. So thinking through what are the things that we should actually pay attention to, and probably figuring that stuff out before you hire the agency, maybe using ChatGPT and saying, look, we're looking at hiring an agency to manage XYZ. We would like to know what are the things that we should be monitoring along the way to make sure that agency is doing what we actually want them to do and moving toward the goals that we're wanting to achieve. And I would also argue you're doing the agency a disservice if you don't do that. Now, as John said, I think they should do that. Like the agency should come to you and kind of have an idea of what are some of those KPIs and goals that we can talk through with the brand and make sure that we have these kind of set so that we know what we're aiming at. But if the agency doesn't have anything to aim at, then, on the one hand, they could be really bad and you won't know it. On the other hand, they could also be really good and you won't know it because you don't have a KPI to compare against. So it's a losing scenario, I think, for both the brand and the agency when you haven't outlined those goals and target KPIs and whatnot.
Yeah, and I think what you brought up there is so important, especially around ACOS and ROAS. So I think this is one of those things that I feel like can't be said enough and isn't communicated as often as it should be. And it's one of the reasons why I'm, at least for Amazon, and why Amazon is such a different platform, why I'm not a big fan of ACOS or ROAS. And that's because I feel like I could take any account, and if you give me an ACOS goal, I can hit your ACOS goal. The only issue is, what is going to be, your actual, revenue ad from that you're going to get from ad sales. So if you said, hey, John, I want a 10% ACOS. Well, like you talked about, you provide a perfect example of that where you can say, okay, well, if I target all branded terms, technically, and you've got a good brand, technically I've hit a 10% ACOS, but it may not get you where you want to go as far as the brand is concerned, because and that's where you have to do some testing. Are those sales that I would have gotten anyway? What percentage? And there's different ways that you can kind of suss that data out, looking at search query reports and that type of stuff. Because if I turn off all the ads and I'm getting all the sales from my branded terms, then it doesn't make sense for me to advertise on those. Using those types of, or having that understanding. And then the other thing is that, there's other strategies, with low bids and that type of stuff that you can get, kind of incremental sales. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't drive the brand forward, because there's so much relationship between your ad sales and your organic ranking, that those things really have to be viewed together, which makes it very different from advertising on Meta or Google, for example. And so that's where, when we're looking at clients, and again, as Matt mentioned, not every client's a little bit different, and what really matters, what their goals are. But that's where I think one of the biggest numbers that we look at is total advertised cost of sales. So you can see, what is that impact, not only on my sales, but what impact is that having on the organic side of things? And then really looking at what the margins look like. So that's kind of as an account level. But then, as you mentioned, Mike, you have to be looking at also down to the product level of what's my net profit contribution, because that's where, pricing strategies and that type of stuff, which is a lever that I think brand owners don't use enough in order to really do the math on, okay, well, if I raise the price by 20%, but my conversion rate only goes down by 10%, I've actually net profit contribution made progress. Or, in the reverse, where I cut my price by 10%, but my volume goes up by 20%. Like, there's a lot of math that needs to happen there at the product level in order to find where those sweet spots are. And, if you're not paying attention, and I would say that you probably need a couple of KPIs. Personally, I like revenue and tacos. I think those are two very big, at the account level, metrics that are really hard to fudge. Is it possible? Yes, but much harder. And then at the product level, really looking at what is that, net profit contribution.
I think one of the more important things, and to be honest, I don't know that I ever had a conversation with the agency that we're talking about organic rank and how advertising and everything else that we were doing affect that. We went out of stock on a SKU. How does that affect organic rank? For me, ACOS is such a short-sighted metric. I don't really pay attention. I don't even remember the last time I looked at ACOS in the accounts that I manage, because tacos, like you said, John, is a much more indicative metric of how advertising is affecting the overall business, which in my opinion, that's the goal. The goal of advertising is to increase my organic rank for the keywords that matter. Like that's how I look at advertising. And if you're only looking at ACOS, then you're missing out on so much opportunity to increase volume on keywords that you're going to end up getting to the top of page one and getting free sales on it. It was never a conversation that I had. I never saw any sort of report on, these are the keywords that we're targeting. These are the ones that we're a little bit more aggressive on. So it has ACOS is a little bit higher on that, but this is how our organic rank on this keyword has increased over time. And this is the search volume for that keyword. I think that was really missing from the conversations with the agency, that really kind of made things a little bit weird for me, in that, what is our goal? Is our goal just to raise ad spend? It is the top of our season, but what is the result of that? And also, I think answering the question and looking at the data of price changes, John, you mentioned price being a big lever, and it's something that we're testing right now, and understanding what it does and looking at the data and understanding, not just I raised my spend, or, my ACOS went down, but what was the overall goal and how did that affect my organic rank? That was really something that I felt like was missing from the conversations that I had with the agency.
Yeah, I think, again, it was kind of briefly mentioned earlier too, but we're mentioning all of these things, right, that we saw with this agency. And I think the biggest takeaway for me, beyond the make sure you're actually monitoring the KPIs that you care about, is you really have to be careful how much grace you give to an agency in terms of how long you're going to wait to really, say, look, either this issue has to be addressed kind of immediately, and hopefully you've dealt with that, up until then, you haven't just waited until it becomes a massive issue, but, either this gets addressed or we're going to have to move a different direction. And some of those issues we saw kind of earlier on, and because we knew the guys that owned the agency and felt pretty comfortable in what they were trying to create, we just believed they were going to right the ship, right? And I think that was problematic. We gave way too much leeway on that and didn't really say, look, this has to be fixed, and it has to be fixed immediately, because if, in order for us to know that you're moving us in the right direction, we need to know these things. We need to understand what is the actual strategy behind what you're doing and the changes that you're making and those sort of things. And we didn't do that. And so that's on us. And I think that, every brand owner needs to pay attention to that and make sure that they're addressing it and not just kicking the can down the road, so to speak, because it's easy to do that, right? Like, you don't want to have to try to find another agency, and you've already kind of offloaded a lot of things to that agency. And the people on your team are now doing different roles or taking care of different things. And as soon as you drop that agency, if you don't have a replacement for them, well, then all of these people, now you have to change your whole structure again. So it's a really kind of difficult decision to make. And so I think it's probably easy to just kind of kick that can and hope that it's going to turn around. You can't afford to do that. We did that, and we're going to pay for it.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing that I would say to brand owners, that are like, hey, I'm going to, find, a PPC person from, Pakistan or whatever. And that's not to say that, there are diamonds in the rough of people from, Pakistan and India who are fantastic. But for every, good one, there's probably 1,000 bad ones. And really looking at what that opportunity cost is, because it's not, necessarily, yeah, you might pay an agency, that's based here in the US, or somebody, at the end of the day that knows what they're doing a heck of a lot more. But assuming that they're doing their job, your downside risk is a lot less than if you're paying somebody, $2 an hour, $4 an hour in Pakistan or India to, manage your, $10,000 or $20,000 in ad spend. You can very easily make up that opportunity cost difference if, they're barely competent at it at $4 an hour versus somebody who knows what they're doing, at $50 an hour.
You're muted again, Matt.
My cat is, I have to mute her for my cat. But the challenge with that, and again, this is nothing against anybody from particular countries, but the challenge with that is I think that the genesis of one of these things is that there's a big giant Facebook group with a whole bunch of people from a specific country that want to be VAs. And they've gone through this training. There's hundreds of thousands of people in this group. They've gone through this training and they've learned not so great ways to market themselves as virtual assistants, as Amazon analysts, let's call them. And the challenge is that when you work with some of these agencies, there are some agencies out there that employ a whole bunch of these VAs, let's call them, that aren't necessarily trained on how to manage an account that's spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, but that might not necessarily be all that apparent to you because your communication with the agency is with the owner or the sales guy or, maybe an account manager. So I think that's another thing. And I don't want to say that I feel like the wool was pulled over our eyes, because I don't feel like that. I do know, though, that our account manager with this particular agency, or the person that was pulling the levers inside of the campaigns, at least for a time, was an overseas person that was the one that was putting together these reports for us. And I think I mentioned that the reports weren't all that great that we were getting from them. And it was very obvious that this person was a very low level type of a PPC analyst that was only paying attention to a few metrics and didn't really understand what was going on behind the scenes. So that's one thing that I will throw out there as a caution. I think it's important to really, when you're working with an agency, really understanding the expertise level of the person that's actually pushing the buttons and pulling the levers in the account. Because I feel like that was kind of happening in our account, at least for a little bit.
Well, and like you said earlier, Matt, if you don't already understand, at least at a bird's eye level, let's just take PPC since we're on that topic. If you don't actually understand the, let's say, current most accepted strategies, and I'm not going to say strategy because, there are agencies who do things different from one another, and there's some things that they may not agree on. But if you haven't taken the time to at least understand at that bird's eye level what those strategies are, why they employ them, and at least the basic foundational aspects of how they employ them, then you will not be able to intelligently have those conversations with an agency that you hire. And it will be really easy for them to pull the wool over your eyes, intentionally or not. Maybe they're just not that great and they think they're better than they are, and you don't know any different. And so between the two of you, it's blind leading the blind, right? Or they are relatively good at what they do, but they realize they can just kind of phone it in because you have no idea, and they can just meet the ACOS goal that you gave them or whatever, and you're going to be happy because you don't know what's going on. So you really do need to take some time before you're going to hire an agency to do anything in your business to make sure you at least understand that stuff at kind of a foundational level, so you can have that intelligent conversation, so you can know what kind of KPIs you should be monitoring to make sure they know what they're doing, so you know what the campaign structure should look like, so you can take a peek once in a while and make sure that is actually what they're doing, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I would really encourage brands, to talk to at least 3 to 5 agencies and really get particular about, and I think you guys have already brought it up, and I just want to, double click on it, which is really getting into the nitty gritty of how they would apply, their strategies or their principles, and we're talking a lot about ads, but the same thing could be said for listing optimization, for, fixing catalog issues, for inventory. Hey, from step 1 to step 10, what is your process, and having them walk through their, what's their regular process and how would they apply to your brand. And really the more detailed that process is, and, again, give it the common sense test if those, steps make sense to you. If they're giving, the more detailed that process is, typically the better thought out it is, the more experienced they're going to be with working with brands like you. Now, the other thing that I would add is that that's where, talking to 3 to 5 agencies is helpful, and maybe even more depending on your level of experience. If you don't know hardly anything about, PPC, I'd probably, I would recommend brands talk to 5 to 7 agencies, because what you'll start to see is that once you've done, you've talked to a few of them, you're going to see a lot of different things that rhyme, and you're going to get a much better feel for who knows what they're talking about and who's just kind of, doing some hand waving and saying, hey, we optimize your PPC and we, negate keywords to get rid of ads, wasted ad spend, and kind of these magic words of, we're never going to have wasted ad spend. Well, okay, so you're going to tell me that every one of your clicks is going to convert? I'd love to see that. So, I think that's really what it boils down to is that depending on your level of experience is going to depend on the number of, agencies that you probably need to interview before you find that one that's going to do a good job for you and going to be a good fit for your brand.
Yeah, I think what you'll also find out in that interview process, which I think is important, is how well, and I think it's important to ask this question. I've been in sales and the agency world for many years, and I used to hate this question because it ended up requiring me to do a whole lot more before getting a signed contract. But being on the brand management side, I think I do appreciate the question a whole lot more. It's when brands want to ask you to meet the person that is actually going to be managing the account. And, I think that I've actually been with agencies in the past as in the sales that it almost, and it felt a little bit dirty to me because it was almost like a bait and switch, where it was a very specific agency who, depending on the level of ad spend, you would either go with the A ad team or the B ad team. And the person didn't know which ad team they were going to. And they were always talking to the A team in the meetings. And I didn't love that, especially the brands that, were either new or weren't at the revenue levels that some of the bigger brands that we worked with. It felt not so great to me. So I think understanding who the person is that you're going to be contacting with and meeting that person in the beginning, I think having some sort of level of rapport with the person that you're going to be working with on a regular basis is important. And I don't hate that question anymore. I don't hate asking the question of, can I meet the person of who I'm going to actually be working with? I think that's important. And being on the other side of those relationships now I really understand why brand owners wanted to do that. And I think it's an important step.
Well, I think the other thing I want to make sure that we also double click on is what you brought up, Mike, as far as like how much grace do you give to an agency? And I think this is one of those things where having a regular cadence for meetings and that type of stuff is important. And also making sure that you're focusing on that KPI and really tracking that. And, talking with that agency and saying, okay, this is where we want this KPI to be. What is realistic that we could have by next week or 2 weeks from now? What does that look like? So that way you're setting some clear milestones. Because again, as an agency owner, I've been on the other end of it where somebody's like, hey, I want to triple my sales this month. And it's like, okay, well, do you want to triple your ad budget? So having those types of discussions of like, hey, what's realistic that we can accomplish in a week, 2 weeks, a month? And then, based on what your goal is. So that way you're getting agreement between the brand and the agency. That's where I see it most successful of like, hey, this is what the milestone next week should look like and what a milestone 2 weeks should look like, and really checking in on those milestones. Because I think, what we've experienced with that is if it's super clear, we're going to do everything in our power in order to meet or exceed that milestone. And it makes it a lot easier for prioritizing, hey, what does this brand care about?
Yeah, it also makes me think, John, that okay, yes, you have, you're bringing an agency on. Hopefully, you've taken the time ahead of that to at least lay down what you think are reasonable goals, say, for 6 months, 3 months, maybe 12 months, whatever. But also, you mentioned this early in the conversation, and that was, and you mentioned it more from the agency side, but I also think it's just as valuable from the brand side. And that is, what are some things that need to be done that would be under the responsibility of this agency, that would have a significant impact, and that you can generally say should be able to be accomplished in a week or 2 or maybe 4, right? Mm-hmm. Some of those things that you can say that you get a chance to evaluate more early on. So you set a goal and say, look, in 2 weeks' time, these things should be finished, right? It doesn't really have anything specifically to do with, say, performance indicators, like CM3 or ACOS or TACOS or things like that, but more so like, did these things get done? And then being able to evaluate, how did it get done? Like, for instance, a listing, refresh. Maybe it's not images, it's just the text content, and maybe keyword optimization and some things like that. And saying, hey, look, in 2 weeks, we'd like to have these however many listings all refreshed with new, content, updated keyword focus and optimization. And then when that's done, I'd like to have a report of what was done, why it was done. And then I get to evaluate it and kind of look, does it read well? Does it look like it's gibberish and that it was written by somebody overseas whose English is the second language, and it gives you something to kind of hang your hat on and say, okay, well, step 1, they did that. They did it well. It seems correct. Let's move forward. I do have a question for you though, John, because one of the things that for a long time I've really kind of looked at as being, I don't know, in my opinion, kind of a standard way to operate. And I think that piece that I just mentioned is one that I haven't done very well. And I think it's something that we should do kind of moving forward. But in a larger scale, when you bring on an agency, how long do you believe that it makes sense to say, okay, unless something goes egregiously wrong, we're giving you 2 months or 3 months. And it probably depends a little bit on what type of agency is it and what do you want them to do and how quickly should they be able to ramp something up. But like for me, when I say, okay, I'm going to have somebody new handle PPC, right? Well, you've got to take it from whatever the campaign structure was before, and you got to transition that potentially to whatever you want the campaign structure to be. And there's this period over which you can't just turn off everything that was already there, but you also can't just turn on everything that you want. And so you like, what's the length of that process? And you have to give them time to be able to make that transition, to start moving the numbers in the right direction, to start getting that campaign set up, optimized, to get enough history behind the campaigns that they start producing better. So I think that's key, that in most cases, my guess would be if you're hiring on an agency and you're going to make an evaluation in a month whether to keep them, it better be only like, okay, as long as nothing egregious happens, we'll keep going. But if something really goes off the rails, a month later, I'm going to terminate this and move on. What are your thoughts on that? Because I feel like that's an important piece of this.
Great question. Great question. And I think it really circles back to what you touched on before, which is, because you're right. I mean, it really depends on the size of the account. For brands that are 7 figures plus, there's probably, there's usually years worth of campaign history. I'll give you one, my personal red flag is any agency that says, hey, we're just going to turn off all the ads that you currently have running. We're going to create all new accounts, run the other direction. So I will say that. That said, most agencies that are good at what they do at this point, that's not going to be their approach. They're going to do exactly what you're talking about, which is, hey, we're going to have to ramp up some new campaigns. Then we're going to have to modify the campaigns that are currently in existence because we want to take advantage of that history that's already there and what's already working. And so I think that's where it kind of circles back to what you were talking about earlier, which is starting by measuring inputs instead of outputs. So I know ultimately we all, there's certain results that we all want to get out of, whether it's ads or, specific portion of the business, and then ultimately out of the business as a whole. And really what it starts, when you're starting that relationship, I think measuring those inputs and having that discussion of the agency of like, hey, what are the inputs that we should see in this first week as we onboard? What are the inputs we should see in the first, 2 to 3 weeks? And then what are those inputs that we should see, in the first month or two? And if they're hitting those inputs, what I would say is that generally, I would give, them 2 to 3 months before you really start measuring the results end of it. And really in those first couple of months, really focus on measuring those inputs. Now, as you said, Mike, if there's something that goes completely off the rails, then that's kind of a different conversation of, where they make a massive mistake that's, costing you a huge amount of money. Like, it's hard to give grace for something like that. That said, I think those situations are few and far between. I think most brands are kind of in that position that you were talking about of like, hey, I want to hand this off to this agency, but I don't know how to measure them in those first couple of months to know, is it because it's the transition or is it because they're just not that good? And so that's where I think in those first couple of months, and I would say 2 to 3 months, especially with, 7-figure plus brand, we're really measuring those inputs. And again, there should be a very clear discussion about, hey, here's the inputs that we're going to be working on and what that timeline looks like. So that way you can hold them accountable to those inputs.
I actually really like the input versus output, just that moniker, just like labeling it. Okay.
Yep.
We're measuring inputs for the first couple of months. Then we're shifting to measuring outputs. Maybe over that third month, we're transitioning to measuring outputs. By the time you're reaching, that month 3 mark, you should, for the most part, be measuring outputs. They should be solidified enough in your account where that's where your focus should be able to be. So I really kind of like that idea. And I would imagine that most brands are probably like myself, who were very output oriented, but realized we can't really measure outputs so much until we get 2 or 3 months in.
Yep.
And so then no measurement happens at all. There's really no serious evaluation that's being made in that period because you're giving them grace. Being able to measure those inputs, I think, is a really good way to make sure you're still moving in the right direction. And then the only other thing that I would say is then, okay, if you're setting out inputs, make sure that the inputs that they tell you they're going to do and that you're going to measure make sense to you as to, are they actually going to get us to the outputs that we're looking for? Like if those inputs don't have any direct impact on the outputs that we've said we want, well, then that in and of itself doesn't make sense.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I think that's, really what it boils down to is, and the other thing that I would say is that give yourself, that 2 to 3 month period of evaluation for that agency. So it becomes delegation rather than abdication. I'm not saying that that's what happened in your case, Mike, but I do see this a lot. And I mean, for us, it's, we try to take that, very seriously in the sense of realize that some brand owners, they just, they really just want to wipe their hands of it, which I totally understand, especially when, it's very time intensive. It's very, knowledge intensive, and they want to work on other channels and launching that next new product and that type of stuff. And that's the reason that they hire us. So I'm totally fine with that. But I would just say from the brand perspective, I would really encourage brands, to really be very involved in that first 3 months to making sure that everything is on track. So that way, it's not as painful of a process if you're not getting the inputs that you think you should be to eventually get to, those more sales, a better conversion rate, all those other things that we all, ultimately want in order to move the brand forward.
I think the only last thing that I would probably add, and this kind of just occurred to me, but I think it's an important piece, and that is over those first few months, especially documenting, like documenting what are the results, what are the inputs that they said they were going to do? Did they hit those, did they do them on time, right? What are the outputs that we said we were going to reach when we hit the 3-month mark? Have we hit those milestones, and just documenting whether they hit it or not. And then also taking some notes on that to say, this is why we think they didn't, or this is what actually happened versus what was supposed to happen. Because realistically, when it comes time, you essentially have a journal then, so that you don't forget any of what happened over those first 3 months, and you can really evaluate better, at that juncture where you're like, okay, let's decide what, are we moving forward or aren't. You have a better, you have more evidence on which to make those decisions, I think.
Yeah. And I would encourage brands, to come with that with a even keel, in the sense of, there's always, I'm thinking about, some clients that we've worked with, and Matt, probably feels this way more than I do, of where, hey, we've created an amazing new main image for them or for their product. And, we're working through the widgets in order to, get Amazon to actually not only, so they approve the image, but for whatever reason, it's not showing. Like, there's always going to be like those little hangups in the system. So it's not that like that main image is live and up and, running perfectly on that date, but more of, was the image done? Was it submitted to Amazon on that date? And then, inevitably in a certain portion of those projects, there's going to be some sort of rework that has to be done because Amazon didn't index it, or some little thing needs to be fixed with it, or whatever. So, just come into that with an even keel and look at, what's also within that agency's control and your control, and then what is not. And, are they doing those inputs that are within their control? And if so, that's a really good sign. While at the same time, understanding that there's certain inputs, especially on Amazon, whether something goes live or not, that isn't always in the brand's control or the agency's control.
Matt, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. We're getting a little bit long in the tooth on this episode, but I think on that point that John just raised, this question of, what is beyond the agency's control, right? I think it's valuable to make sure that you pay attention to that. I think it's also valuable to pay attention to, I guess, a recognition of the fact that as an agency and as a brand, we should both know that that's likely going to happen with a certain percentage. So what are we setting as the date? Like, are we saying, okay, have the images done by this date, but we know it might take a little bit of time to get some of them approved? Or are we saying we want images approved, ready, active, whatever by this, but giving a little bit of extra room on that? But also, I think, and this is why I'm asking you, Matt, is in the sense of sometimes the delays on the agency side are related less to what the agency is doing and also what Amazon is doing, and more to what is the brand doing? Are they responding back to inquiries from the agency? Are they getting them the digital assets that they need? Are they, those sorts of things? And making sure that you've got somebody who's assigned there to make sure that when they ask a question, they get an answer. And when they need something, they get what they need. And when you decide to make that evaluation of, do we continue or not? Are they doing their job or not? At least taking a step back and owning the parts of that process where maybe as a brand you failed as opposed to the agency.
Yeah, 100%. That is 100% right. I mean, in the end, it is a partnership, and I think it's a mistake to walk away, to wipe your hands of something and hand it off to an agency for them to manage all by themselves. And I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what happened in this very specific instance that we're talking about. Obviously there were things on both sides. There were things on their side. There were things on our side that went beyond the normal amount of time to get things done. And there were reasons for all of it. And I think treating it more like a partnership and and really understanding what the strengths are of the agency and what your strengths are as the brand owner, the representative of the brand. I think those are two very important things to understand. And, I think that I've learned a lot about relationships with agencies and what to expect and what not to expect, but also just the communication between. That's why I think it's important to have a good rapport with the brand manager or whoever the person is that's managing the account, because the better rapport you have with them, the more you're going to be able to have those hard conversations when something goes awry or something is taking longer than it should. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it, is treating it like a partnership, but also having a good rapport with the person that you're working with directly.
All right. Well, I think this is a pretty good place to wrap for this episode. Mike, any last thoughts now that, as you go through this process of, maybe one or two things in the future you do differently based on your experience?
I really like the idea of measuring inputs in those first couple of months. I think that's key, and making sure to determine what inputs are likely to move you in the right direction toward being able to measure appropriate outputs and whatever those goals are. So I really like that. And then I think the other piece of that is really looking at it as a partnership and recognizing there is no perfect agency. Every single agency out there is going to have things they're really good at and some things that maybe they're somewhat good at, right? And you have to really determine what those are. So take some time to evaluate that. Decide whether when you hire that agency, you choose to hire them only for their core competencies, and maybe you want to take care of those other things that maybe they're sort of good at and they could do it for you, but maybe you'd be better off continuing to manage that yourself or getting a different agency to do it. Because I really think in the best case scenario, even though it might be easier to hire one agency to do a whole bunch of different things, you may get better results from coordinating between 2 or 3 agencies and just paying them for the core competency that they should be really good at.
I think some great discussion here. So I think this is a great place to wrap. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we look forward to having you on another Tactics Tuesday.